Welcome back to Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization, where we're always seeking better ways to challenge the status quo and help create an extraordinary future. I'm Ira Wolfe. Today's episode is a special one. Instead of diving into a new conversation, we're going to step into a time machine. Over the past year, in addition to hosting over 100 Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization shows, I've had an opportunity to be a guest on dozens of other podcasts. Today, we'll revisit one of my favorite guest appearances. It's a chance to echo the insights and inspiration shared there, right here with Googleization Nation. I hope you'll enjoy listening as much as I did sharing my vision for the future of work.
Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, the fortnightly podcast that talks about self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. If you want to be a better leader and a better work colleague, then join me, your host, Nia Thomas, as we talk to today's Knowing Self, Knowing Others guest. Listeners, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Ira Wolfe. And I first came across Ira when I was listening to the Geeks, Geezers and Googleization podcast, which is just brilliant. If you haven't listened to it, you really, really must. And Ira is a founding member and a co-host with Jason Cochran on that podcast. And it's just brilliant. But Ira describes himself as one of his reasons, raison d'etre, is helping others find a better way to be extraordinary. Now, how amazing is that, listeners? Also describes himself as terrified and fascinated by VUCA level change. Now, for those of you who don't know what VUCA is, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I bet you're already out there, listeners, thinking that that would fit very well with your organization. Describes himself as a millennial in a baby boomer body, a Hall of Fame speaker, and a future of work global thought leader. Ira, it's absolutely brilliant to have you here. Please do introduce yourself to listeners.
Hey, thanks very much. I think you did the introduction just fine, and I really appreciate that. Again, it's a great opportunity to be here and talk about VUCA and all the implications and where the world is headed.
Absolutely. Ira, how do you define self-awareness?
That's a great question. How do I define self-awareness? One is, I would say it's the journey of having a relationship with ourselves. So it's understanding, traditionally, and certainly the definitions and the experiences I was exposed to up until, I'm continuing on this journey. The experiences that we had was really around understanding yourself. But I think true self-awareness is really understanding the relationship you have with yourself. And that may in fact just be another way of saying emotional intelligence, because certainly emotional intelligence is made up of self-awareness and then your ability to manage your emotions and then understand that other people's emotions, and also understand how to relate to other people's emotions. So I think it's more, I think self-awareness is very much a relationship we have with our own selves. And, certainly some people are in love with themselves, which is not necessarily a healthy relationship, but maybe to love oneself rather than be in love with yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting that discussion about, is self-awareness an element of emotional intelligence, or is emotional intelligence an element of self-awareness? And when you read the literature, there are different schools of thought, and somebody goes one way and somebody goes another. And I guess my view is that self-awareness is bigger than emotional intelligence. But absolutely, when you hear Goleman's definition of emotional intelligence, self-awareness is right in there.
Oh, absolutely. And it really is a journey. I'm an older baby boomer, and most people have long gone and to go, hey, you're done. The chapter's closed. What else can I learn? And, here I am, I'm teaching classes in a master's level program for organizational change, which obviously is a good fit with VUCA. But one of the reasons I do that is I'm still on this journey. I mean, I want to know what are 22-year-olds thinking? What are 30-year-olds thinking? What are 40-year-olds thinking? And you have that opportunity. But every single day is people say, why are you still working so hard? And frankly, I don't think I'm working hard. I'm just realizing that there is a limited amount of time I'll have on this earth, as we all do. We just don't know when that'll be. And there's just so much more I want to figure out. And it's an exciting time to do that.
Most definitely. Just like me, I'm on that learning journey, and I hope that learning journey never stops. What are your thoughts on the relationship between self-awareness and leader effectiveness?
Oh, I don't know how you can be an effective leader without having self-awareness. And in fact, I mean, and most every model, and again, we talked just a few minutes ago about, whether whether self-awareness is part of emotional intelligence, or emotional intelligence, drives self-awareness, whatever that might be. But when it comes to leadership, it's a direct connection. I don't know how you can be an effective leader. The title, you can be a leader and have that in their title, but we already know that not all leaders can lead. But to be able to lead effectively, especially in these days, and thank you for mentioning my podcast. Just the other day, we did a podcast on mental health in the workplace, how that's changed, and how critical that's going to be, and certainly the trend of workplaces and people, and what it's not really work-life balance, but work-life integration. But how do we put all that together? In the past, when employee-employer relationship was transactional, it's I give you a paycheck, leave all your baggage at the door, walk through the door, do what we tell you to do, go home, pick up your baggage, and leave, and we paid you for your time here, then self-awareness really didn't matter. Those days are gone. I mean, we're living in an age where if you don't treat people right, it's unlikely you're going to be in business for very long. So I don't know how you can even lead poorly without having some self-awareness.
I've certainly talked to other people about the leaders who are more towards that narcissistic side of self-awareness, and they are leading in organizations, but they do not really have followers. They have people who just stick around for the paycheck, but nevertheless they are getting the figures, they're getting the KPI, they're getting the money through the door. What are your thoughts on how are they there? How are they staying there? Are they the people who are time limited in their roles?
It's a complicated question. So as you were asking me that, my mind immediately goes to Elon Musk.
Sure.
And Steve Jobs was not necessarily the most well-liked leader. They admired his creativity, his motto, what he was creating, his aspirations, his brilliance. But he really wasn't necessarily the most liked leader. So we can go through history. I mean, we can go back and find out leaders who, were incredibly successful and narcissistic and authoritarian. Yeah. But that doesn't, and I believe that's always going to be true. I mean, there's always going to be people because of some uniqueness. Again, you can't take away Elon Musk's brilliance, his forward, and despite what you think of him and if you like of him, Twitter may or may not survive. It may not live to go on. But how he changed the world with Tesla and the model. I mean, he disrupted the world, and he had this vision to do that. And who knows what else he's going to come up with, but he's not very good with people. And that's probably where that self-awareness comes in. Because if he was self-aware, he would have stayed in the background, maybe let other people be the hatchet people, or just say, I need to be in order to do what I do best. And that's part of self-awareness. I mean, sometimes it's understanding the limitations. So long way around an answer to your question, but ultimately, I think we're always going to have narcissistic, authoritarian, dictator-like, very poor with people leaders. And again, some of them may be self-aware and say, I don't give a crap. But in order to grow companies, I think brands, and in order to grow companies, and the more complex that the world gets, and especially in the U.S. and many developed countries around the world, there's just a shortage of people for the demand. So it's going to be a supply and demand problem. We are going to have labor shortages regardless of how many people get laid off in the next year or two or three, because the demographics, again, especially in the U.S., Canada, many of the European countries, I believe in Australia is a little bit younger. country, New Zealand. So there's pockets of that. But if you want to have a business and you need people, you're going to have to treat people differently. And so I think that's, if it used to be like an 80-20 rule, or maybe, I don't even know if it was that, if that's good, that may be giving the benefit of the doubt to people. But let's say it was 50-50. 50% of leaders were really, really good. They took care of their people. 50% didn't. But they got away with it.
Yeah.
That shift, I think you're going to see that more and more companies are going to have to be. And that's already happening, because now we also have the shift from male to female leadership. Now, we don't have a lot of CEOs in the publicly traded companies that are women, but certainly in the small, medium-sized markets, entrepreneurship, a lot of people, women, a lot of the leaders are women, and it just may be, men are from Mars, women are from, what was it? Men are from Mars,
women are from Venus.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we're different. There's leadership styles, and hopefully that's going to change. Hopefully, men will get it, and women will have that opportunity.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what the world of leadership looks like in the next 5 to 10 years.
We're seeing it now.
Do you think effective leaders can be found at all levels, and why? What's really influenced your view?
Oh, absolutely. And it goes back to leadership's not a title. I mean, you may have it in your title, but that doesn't make you a good leader. So there are, and sociology, a lot of the social studies, I heard this, it's probably 25 years ago, maybe even more. And it was almost like, it was before TED Talks, and there was an event that a friend invited me to in Scottsdale, Arizona. And each year they used to invite leaders to come in and speak about leadership, personal development, the future. And I remember, and I sort of blew it off at the time, because they had like the former CEO of HBO, how disruptive that was going to be in the future. They had the orchestra master of maybe the Boston Philharmonic, and he was a pianist. But it was like he talked, and there was these unique abilities of people who led that we normally wouldn't think of, because they didn't have leadership in their title. But there was a sociologist, anthropologist who spoke. I know she was from the University of Southern California, can't remember her name, but she talked about the matrix. She talked about the influencers within an organization, that we used to have a hierarchy from top down, and many organizations still do. And yet she said the power of an organization rarely was held, except in those narcissistic dictatorship authoritarian, was rarely held at the top, was rarely within the C-suite, within the boardroom. And they started to study this, and this is remarkable because it's 25 years ago. They looked at the hotspots. It's like heat map. It's like, where is the most influence in your company? And oftentimes it could have been the administrative assistant, the receptionist. Oftentimes it was an employee within a department who had the greatest influence, and it wasn't the manager, it wasn't a supervisor, it was somebody without a title, but they had a great deal of influence, and it didn't tie to tenure or even education. Again, so leadership is at any level, and we finally started to accept that followership is a form of leadership.
Wouldn't it be interesting if more organizations took the plunge and created something like a heat map for their organization to understand where power was, where leadership was, and how that was changing throughout their lifespan, and whether the people at the most strategic level would be surprised?
And again, could be very controversial, but if there is a benefit to social media, if there was a benefit to that will help organizations understood it and didn't write it off, to understand the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Instagrams and the TikToks of the world. They're influencers.
Yeah.
And they're technically nobodies until they had a niche, they had something to say, and they had an ability to influence others. But that's not new. We just did it before. It just wasn't as amplified as it is now with social media. But in the past, social media certainly created that opportunity for a lot of people. Now, it's not all good stuff, but nobody's saying that being an influencer in an organization, being a leader in an organization isn't always positive either. So I think that's another important aspect of that as we're sort of brainstorming here and talking out loud, is that we assume that to be an effective leader, that means it's all positive. But there's a lot of dictators in our history that were very effective leaders, big influencers. We won't go into the current politics, recent politics, some of the headline news, but going back through history, that were incredibly effective leaders.
I really like that idea of thinking about leaders as influencers, because when you think about it from the 21st century perspective, if we use the word influencers, it opens a whole different world to thinking about leadership, doesn't it?
I'm going to go back to probably one of the biggest influences on my life that we had, and it's going to go back to something I think we talked about this before we went on the air, was Warren Bennis, who came up with the term VUCA, the volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And he came up with that in the 80s to understand what type of leaders were we going to need in the future, because our world was going to be so unpredictable and uncertain. And that was the acronym he used. But he described leaders as, well, he described managers of getting people to do what you want to do. That was their role. Leaders were getting people to want to do what you wanted them to do.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't, and until today, I wouldn't have necessarily said, oh, that's about influencer. But that's certainly shaped my mindset of what leadership looked like. Is leaders, a leader gets people to want to do what you want them to do. Now, you can do that through punishment. So there's another side to that. But it's really to get them to do it on their own, to want to do what they want them to do.
Do you think leaders at the most strategic level of organizations have greater self-awareness than leaders at other levels of organizations? And I think we've touched on this as we've talked through, and I think it feeds through a lot of the discussions we've had.
Yeah, it's a maybe. It's a definite. Again, there's many organizations that have done well in order to be successful in today's market and continue to grow and again evolve. That those leaders, in order to be effective, at least some of those leaders had a level of self-awareness, a high level of emotional intelligence to be able to do what they do. I don't think you can sustain itself and compete long term, especially in today's market where where life cycles are so short, to be able to do that. I think there's more and more that do that. I certainly think we're far away from saying if they've achieved a certain level of success, then they have self-awareness. Again, we'll go back to Elon Musk. I think that there's certainly high levels that have demonstrated that they don't. And, I always describe, I recently sold my business, which was Success Performance Solutions, and had over 28 years, and it was focused exclusively on pre-employment leadership assessments. And we'd meet with people and we identify what they had, where they were. But I never looked at them as, oh, you're going to be good or bad. I always said, here's your starting point. And one of the metaphors that I use, and anybody that's listening to this that knows me has probably heard this before, is that, you're driving a vehicle and you got 3 round tires, or you have 4 round tires, but there's an air leak. We want to know, when do you need that 4th tire? And what happens if it starts to go flat? So a lot of times people say, well, this is a 90% match for leadership. And I go, okay, what's the 10% that could derail them? And it wasn't on the negative side. At some point, because we were living in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, they're going to meet a situation where if they rely on what they did in the past and it worked, may not work in the future. So again, that's self-awareness. Many people are familiar with strengths finders, and people interpreted it completely wrong. Is that they go, here's your top 5 or top 10 strengths, and people say, oh, just ignore their weaknesses. But over time, and as the environment changes and the world got more complex, and given the last 3 years living in a world of uncertainty and unpredictability, which is just going to continue, is you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And that's what happens. So without understanding what your vulnerabilities are, even if they've never impacted you before, throwing out a lot of terms here, but you're probably familiar with it, but I don't know if a lot of listeners are, with a fixed mindset and a growth mindset.
Yes.
So, fixed mindset is I've got a set of fixed skills. And I'm just naturally gifted at it. And if I just learn to use those skills, I'm good. But there's a problem with that because times change, environments change, people change. We got to continually learn. We got to continually evolve. And then there's a fear factor of, well, if I try that, I'll look stupid. And then if I make a mistake, people won't hold me in the highest respect. So I got to do everything to protect who I was, where I was. I got good grades. Look at my success. Where, the growth mindset is that opportunity is, hey, we talked about it already. We're just on a journey. We're constantly learning. There's things we did before and we thought we were good at, and you go, wow, I wish I could do that over again. I look things that I wrote, that I did, decisions I made, and they were right at the time with the information that I had. And maybe I got away with it just because the world wasn't as complex as it was. But now you don't have that opportunity. So we really need to understand, one is what some of our vulnerabilities are. And those may change as we go on because it may have been maybe a little bit of a vulnerability in the past, but now it's a significant vulnerability. But moving forward, we need to know when that tire can go flat. When are the wheels going to start to come off? And so even people that are at the highest level now or were in 2019 and early 2020 found themselves maybe not as effective as they were. And you can look through the pandemic and the responses of organizations of people who, I guess it's the CEOs, the corporate leaders who shared their vulnerabilities. They were transparent that we've never been in this. We don't know how to do it. When people were looking at them for decisions. I remember being on some webcasts, some webinars with some and would have never had that opportunity had it not been for the pandemic, to see them. And they were working from home. And in walk a dog or a cat jumps up on the desk. The child walks in, the grandchild walks in, and they finally understood, and they shared what it was like to be a parent and an employee and be vulnerable. And those leaders became very successful. Now, whether they all had high self-awareness before or whether that was their wake-up call, they got it. And yet others still created that when you're on this call, this is the way it is. There cannot be no interruptions. You have to figure out a way to keep your kids in the other room. Your cat's off the table. You can't broadcast from your bedroom. Well, that might have been the only room that they had because that's where employees lived. And you got to see inside them. So the pandemic really had a lot of benefits. And it was a wake-up call to a lot of organizations what authenticity, what transparency, what vulnerability really look like. But again, if you didn't have that maturity, whether it's maturity or self-awareness, then leadership failed and those companies failed. They failed in more than this supply chain. They literally failed.
It's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking there is very much the journey. There is self-awareness, vulnerability, learning, flexibility, adaptability. All of those things are part of this journey of self-awareness. And I think it's a cycle that moves forward. It's that wheel that keeps turning, that moves and moves. And you have to learn all of those things and develop all of those things as you go forward.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought those skills up, and we use a model. It's called the ACE model, and it looks at adaptabilities. What are the abilities you need to adapt and change and evolve? And then it looks at some personality traits, with C as the character and E as the environment. So in order to do that, you need a healthy environment. You need to know that management supports you. You need to know that you have good team support and relationships with that. Psychologically a safe space. That there is a sense of well-being, but that's all the corporate side, and most companies are still trying to figure that part out. But on the ability side of what were the abilities? You mentioned some of them, but there was so much written about in the pandemic about grit and resilience. I think the words of the year, one year was grit, one year was resilience, and you need both. You need to be gritty. You need, and again, it's not just persevering. It's not continually running into the wall till you break through. It's also having a passion to do that. So if you're just gritty, and that's workaholism. I mean, you're a workaholic. But if you have a passion to do that, which means you have a purpose to do that, then that helps. And then resilience, no matter what you do, there's going to be setbacks, unpredictability, uncertainty, and you got to bounce back and bounce back quickly. But the other three, so those were two of the five adaptabilities that we talk about. The other three you mentioned was mental flexibility. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, cognitive dissonance, but we also have to learn how to connect the dots, color outside the lines, whatever phraseology you want to use. We got to deal with that. But the one that was really interesting was unlearning. It's not learning, it's unlearning. Yeah. Because we can learn all these everything that we need to do, but we got to stop doing what's not working any longer. So it wasn't learning was an adaptability. It was unlearning was the ability, the people who were most successful at change and adapting, which is being aware of when you need to unlearn the old behaviors and then how to do that. And then the last one, which I should have mentioned first, was growth mindset. So, so it basically is grit, resilience, mental flexibility, unlearning, and growth mindset. Those are the five. And this was documented also very well by McKinsey. They've done study, Deloitte, and they looked at what did the leaders, what did people that adapt well, that are effective, and not only just leaders with a title, but even those leaders at on the front lines, what did they have in common? And it all came back to adaptability. Now people described it, but the work we did and the work that the groups that I worked with said, okay, here's how do we break adaptability down into skills that people can learn? And those five, we mentioned.
What do you think is an effective way to develop self-awareness?
There's certainly lots of assessments out there. I think one is your willingness. It's the acceptance that you need to do it.
Yeah,
it's just that. I don't know how you can't teach somebody self-awareness. It's a two-way street. Somebody has to be willing to say that I need to be more. I need to have a better relationship with myself before I can have that with others. Maybe that's a twist on Stephen Covey's world. But I have to have a better relationship with myself in order to figure out everything else. But one of the ways that even to get to that point, I will go back to growth mindset. I am a huge proponent. I don't know how people do anything. I don't know how they become more gritty, more resilient, have a more open mind, become smarter, evolve, and ultimately have greater self-awareness than if they don't have at least some bits of growth mindset.
Yeah.
If you think just because you're smart or because you think you're dumb, if you're rich or poor, if you're tall or short, I don't think it matters of what your limitations are if you have a growth mindset. I mean, it's being realistic about what you can do. But ultimately, people just think I'm just good at doing this. Or I'm not good at math, or I'm good at math, or I'm really good with people, or I'm not good with people. When people define themselves by just that really limits them. And that's probably the biggest indication that they need self-awareness. But to grow and improve, and anybody who has a sense of ambition. And I think, most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm wondering how today can be worse than yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, it may turn out that way, but nobody really starts that day by doing that. But then they listen to the people talking on their shoulders and the voices in their head, and then they go back to that. But I think everybody wants to be better, but they may not have been given the opportunity. They didn't learn how. So I think ultimately I can't say it's universal, but I think everything starts with having a growth mindset.
Ira Wolfe, it's been absolutely brilliant having you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a really great conversation. And being the fan of Geeks, Geezers and Googleization as I am, I will continue to listen to you on your podcast. And I will make sure for you listeners that we put the link to the podcast in the show notes as ever. And we will make sure that there's links to Ira's website. But for now, Ira Wolfe, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks very much, Nia. Stay safe. Have a great year.
Thank you for joining me, your host, Nia Thomas, at the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. After every podcast, I'm going to be doing a top takeaways review of the things that I've learned from my discussions with guests, which you can find on my website, knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk, LinkedIn, TikTok, and the other main social media sites. Rates, reviews, and recommendations from you are the best way to get the word out about the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast. Open your favourite podcast app, find the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, take a listen to some episodes, give it some stars and write a little review. A little word from you means a big deal to me. Make sure you bookmark the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast on your favourite podcast player and tune in to the next episode in 2 weeks' time. The Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Good Pods, Podchaser, Amazon Music, Podcast Index, Podcast Addict, Pocket Casts, Deezer,
Thanks for watching Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. Be sure to listen to the podcast and follow us on YouTube.